been standing here too long. What are you really doing in this area?
I'm waiting for my ride share. I'm a civil rights attorney. You have no cause to stop me.
The car is fake. Turn around now, or I'll put you in cuffs.
I am complying under protest. This is an unlawful arrest, and your camera is recording everything.
David Collier had won landmark civil rights cases that changed laws. But he never imagined his most challenging legal battle would begin on a sunny Tuesday afternoon on a downtown sidewalk waiting for a car. At 45, he was a man who commanded respect in a courtroom, his arguments weaving together law history and a deep-seated belief in justice. His voice, calm and measured, had swayed juries and convinced appellate judges. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, the kind of attire that was his daily uniform, he stood outside the Gilded Spoon, one of those downtown eateries where lunch meetings were about power and influence as much as they were about food. The meeting had been a success, securing funding for a new pro bono initiative. He'd just messaged his wife that he was on his way home, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips as he checked his email. The afternoon sun was warm, glinting off the chrome of the passing luxury cars. It was a perfectly ordinary moment in a life built on extraordinary work. A few blocks away, Officer Evan Riley, 34, was having a bad day. It was always a bad day in his mind, just different shades of it. 8 years on the force had curdled his initial desire to help people into a hard, cynical knot of suspicion. He saw the world in black and white, but his categories weren't good and evil. They were belongs and doesn't belong. And his gut, he believed, was never wrong about which was which. His personnel file told a different story. 9 complaints in 8 years, 7 of them alleging racial bias. 2 had been sustained, leading to slaps on the wrist, a written reprimand, a mandatory de-escalation seminar he'd slept through with his eyes open. The other complaints had evaporated into the bureaucratic ether, dismissed for insufficient evidence. His supervisors saw him as a bulldog, aggressive and results-oriented, but lacking a certain finesse. Riley saw himself as a frontline soldier holding back the tide of urban decay. As he drove his patrol car slowly down the affluent boulevard, his eyes scanned the landscape, not for crimes in progress, but for anomalies. His gaze swept over business people in suits, women with expensive shopping bags, and then it locked onto David Collier. Riley's brain, conditioned by years of unchecked prejudice, processed the image instantly. Black man, expensive suit, standing alone outside a high-end restaurant. The equation didn't compute. In Riley's world, a man like that didn't just stand there. He had to be a driver waiting for his boss, maybe. But he was too well dressed for that. He had to be looking for trouble. A drug deal. Casing the joint for a robbery. His mind churned through a Rolodex of negative stereotypes, skipping right past successful attorney or respected community member. Yeah. The very presence of David Collier on that particular sidewalk was to Officer Riley a disruption of the natural order, a problem that needed to be solved. He didn't see a man. He saw a threat. He pulled the patrol car over to the curb, the engine still running, and stepped out onto the pavement, the leather of his duty belt creaking. The afternoon sun cast a long shadow behind him as he began to walk toward the man who had simply, by existing, become his target. Officer Riley didn't approach David with a question. He approached with an accusation. His steps were heavy, deliberate, the sound of his boots on the sidewalk a clear announcement of authority. He stopped a few feet from David, planting his feet in a wide, confrontational stance, his hand resting casually yet menacingly on the grip of his holstered firearm. "You got business around here?" he asked. The question hung in the air, thick with insinuation. It wasn't a friendly inquiry from a beat cop. It was a challenge. David looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from relaxed focus to mild surprise. He took in the officer's posture, the hard set of his jaw, the suspicion in his eyes. He had seen this look 1,000 times before on the faces of opposing counsel on witnesses, and too often on the faces of law enforcement officers just like this one. It was a look that judged, condemned, and dismissed all at once. He maintained his composure, a skill honed through years of navigating tense depositions and hostile cross-examinations. "Good afternoon, Officer David," said, his voice even and calm. "I'm just waiting for my ride share." He offered a polite professional nod, the kind of gesture he would make to a court bailiff. He expected the explanation to suffice to be the simple end to a simple misunderstanding. He was wrong. Riley's lips tightened into a sneer. The man's calmness felt like arrogance to him. A common street tough would have been nervous, maybe stammered an excuse. This man's confidence was in Riley's mind a form of defiance. "A ride share," Riley repeated, drawing the words out as if they tasted foul. "Right. You've been standing here for 10 minutes. I've been watching you." The lie was effortless, designed to destabilize, to put his target on the defensive. In reality, Riley had seen him for less than 60 seconds. David's internal alarm, long calibrated to detect the subtle frequencies of racial profiling, began to ring. He had advised countless clients in this exact situation: stay calm, don't argue, state the facts clearly. "I assure you, officer, I just finished a meeting and booked a car a few minutes ago. It should be here any second." He held up his phone slightly as if to show the app a modern-day proof of purpose. But Officer Riley wasn't interested in proof. He was interested in confirmation of his own bias. "I don't care what your phone says. People don't just loiter in this neighborhood. Why don't you tell me what you're really up to?" The accusation of loitering was a classic pretext, a legal-sounding word thrown around to justify harassment. David knew it well. He'd had laws rewritten to narrow its definition and prevent this exact kind of abuse. The irony was bitter. "Officer, with all due respect, I am not loitering. I am waiting for transportation from a place where I was a paying customer," he said, gesturing with a slight tilt of his head toward the gilded spoon. There is no cause for this interaction. This assertion of his rights, spoken calmly and factually, was like gasoline on a fire. To Riley, it wasn't a statement of law. It was a challenge to his authority. He took a step closer, invading David's personal space. "I'll decide what's cause and what isn't. Now I'm going to ask you again what's your business here, and you better give me an answer I like." The threat was no longer veiled. The sunny downtown street suddenly felt like a closing trap. The ordinary moment had evaporated, replaced by the cold, familiar dread of an encounter that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the color of his skin. David understood this was no longer a conversation. It was a confrontation spiraling downward, guided by the officer's unshakable prejudice. He had reached the point where he had to make a choice. He could continue to passively explain himself, a strategy that was clearly failing, or he could introduce a fact so undeniable it would have to puncture the officer's biased reality. He chose the latter. "Officer, my business here is my own. But since you seem to require justification for my presence, I am a civil rights attorney." David stated, his voice remaining level, betraying none of the frustration building within him. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, a deliberate and non-threatening movement he knew was being scrutinized. He pulled out his wallet and, from it, a hard plastic card. "This is my State Bar Association identification card. You are welcome to verify it." He held out the card. It was a simple object, his picture, his name, David Collier, Esquire, and the official seal of the State Bar. In any reasonable world, this would have been the end of it. It was verifiable official proof of his profession and his legitimacy. It was a key that should have unlocked the officer's rigid suspicion and ended the encounter with a mumbled apology. But Officer Evan Riley's mind was not a reasonable place. His bias was a fortress, and David's evidence was not a key, but a cannonball bouncing harmlessly off its walls. Riley glanced at the ID card with utter contempt. He didn't even take it. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "An attorney. Is that what you're going with today?" he sneered. "Let me tell you something, pal. I've seen better fake IDs from college kids. You can print anything you want on a piece of plastic these days." The dismissal was absolute. In Riley's worldview, a man who looked like David couldn't be a high-powered attorney, so the ID had to be fraudulent. His professionalism wasn't evidence of his station. It was part of the con. David's calm demeanor, his expensive suit, his articulate speech, it was all just a more sophisticated act than what he was used to on the streets. This belief was so deeply ingrained that it overrode the physical evidence presented to him. He was looking at reality and choosing to see a lie because the truth was incompatible with his prejudice. "You think you're smart, don't you? Coming out here in your fancy suit with your fake lawyer card?" Riley continued, his voice rising in volume, drawing the attention of a couple walking past. "Impersonating an attorney is a serious offense. You're in a lot of trouble." The accusation was staggering in its absurdity. David Collier, who had argued before the state Supreme Court, was being accused of faking his own identity. The situation had tipped over from harassment into a surreal, dangerous fiction authored entirely by the officer in front of him. "Officer, that is a legitimate state-issued credential," David said, his patience finally beginning to fray. "My bar number is on that card. You can call it in and verify my identity and my standing with the bar in less than 2 minutes. I am asking you professionally to do that now." He was offering a lifeline, a final chance for procedure and fact to prevail over prejudice. He was, in effect, trying to de-escalate using the very tools of the system the officer represented. But Riley wasn't an agent of that system anymore. He was an agent of his own biases. He saw the request not as a reasonable step, but as a delaying tactic. Another trick from a man he had already convicted in his mind. He shook his head slowly, a grim smile on his face. "We're past that. I'm not calling anyone. You've lied to me, and you're refusing to cooperate." The trap was about to spring. The moment David knew was coming arrived with a brutal finality. Officer Riley had constructed his own reality, one in which a civil rights attorney was a loitering criminal, and a state bar card was a cheap fake. There was no room for truth, only for the confirmation of his prejudice. "That's it. You're done," Riley announced, his hand moving from his gun to his handcuffs. "Turn around. Put your hands behind your back." David stood his ground for a second, the sheer injustice of the command washing over him. He had done nothing wrong. He was a citizen, an officer of the court, being treated like a felon on a sunlit street for no reason other than a policeman's bigotry. "Officer, on what grounds?" David asked, his voice steady, projecting so that anyone nearby might hear. "I have identified myself. I have violated no laws. This is an unlawful arrest." Riley's face contorted with rage. "Grounds? I've got loitering, and now I've got resisting an officer. Turn around now or I'll put you on the ground." The threat was real. David knew that to physically resist would be catastrophic. He had a choice: escalate and risk violence, or comply and fight this battle where he knew how to win in a court of law. He made the calculated decision to submit, but not in silence. As Riley grabbed his arm, David raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting with the clarity of a courtroom orator. "I am complying under protest. My name is David Collier. I am an attorney. This is an unlawful arrest." He saw what he'd hoped for out of the corner of his eye. A woman standing at the restaurant's large picture window had her phone up recording. Across the street, a young man on a bench did the same. The scene was no longer just his word against the officers. It was being documented. Riley wrenched David's arms behind his back with unnecessary force, the sharp metal teeth of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. The cold steel against his skin was a profound violation, a symbol of everything he had fought against his entire career. He was marched toward the patrol car, a spectacle of humiliation for the growing number of onlookers. He was no longer David Collier, Esquire. He was just another black man in handcuffs. His tailored suit, a mockery, his dignity stripped away under the bright afternoon sun. The doors of the Gilded Spoon opened, and a few patrons stepped out, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. Their phones all pointed in one direction. The clicks of the recordings were almost as loud as the snap of the car door, shutting him into the darkness of the back seat. The drive to the precinct was a 12-minute exercise in forced composure. Locked in the back of the patrol car, the cage separating him from Officer Riley David focused his mind. He pushed down the rage and the humiliation, channeling his energy into what he did best, building a case. He mentally cataloged every detail. The time of the initial stop, 2:15 p.m. Riley's refusal to verify his credentials. The exact baseless charges cited, loitering and resisting. The unnecessary tightness of the cuffs. The officer's failure to read him his Miranda rights. He noted the number on the patrol car's partition. He committed Riley's badge number, which he had made a point to read to memory. He was no longer just the victim of this injustice. He was becoming its chief prosecutor. The world outside the tinted windows blurred into a meaningless stream of light and color. Inside the car, everything was sharp, clear, and damning. When they arrived at the precinct, Riley led him through a side door into a noisy, chaotic booking area. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. He was paraded past a long desk where a gray-haired, weary-looking desk sergeant sat observing the flow of human misery. The sergeant, a man named Miller, who had been on the job for 25 years, looked up as Riley approached. He saw the man in the expensive suit, his face a mask of calm control, and then he looked at Riley's smug, triumphant expression. Sergeant Miller had seen this movie before, and it rarely ended well for the department. "What do you have?" Riley Miller asked, his voice flat. "Got a guy loitering downtown giving me a hard time. Claimed to be a lawyer, gave me a fake ID," Riley said, pushing David forward toward the desk. David spoke for the first time since being put in the car, his voice cutting through the noise of the room. "Sergeant, my name is David Collier. That officer arrested me without cause after I presented him with my state-issued Bar Association card and he refused to verify it. I demand to speak with my attorney and with this officer's supervising lieutenant." Sergeant Miller's eyes narrowed. He looked from David's composed face to Riley's defensive posture. The kid was breathing too hard, too amped up. This wasn't the calm of a good arrest. It was the adrenaline of a bad one. "He showed you D. Miller asked Riley, his gaze unwavering. "A piece of plastic. Could have been a library card." Riley scoffed. "Let me see it," Miller commanded. Riley reluctantly pulled David's bar card from his pocket and tossed it on the desk. Miller picked it up. He'd seen hundreds of them over the years. It looked real. The hologram was right. The seal was crisp. He turned it over in his hands. "Collier, you said," he asked, looking at David. David nodded. Miller turned to his computer terminal, his fingers moving slowly over the keyboard. He typed the name into the State Bar's public database. He fell silent, his eyes fixed on the screen. He scrolled down and then scrolled down again. His face, already weary, seemed to age another 10 years. He swiveled his chair back to face Riley, whose smug look was beginning to falter. Riley Miller said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do you have any idea who this is?" He tapped the screen. "This man is not just an attorney. He is David Collier. He argued Johnson versus the state in front of the damn Supreme Court. He's probably the most prominent civil rights lawyer in this half of the country." The room fell silent. Riley's face went white. The full catastrophic weight of his actions finally crashed down upon him. He hadn't just arrested a man. He'd arrested a reckoning. The videos hit the internet like a flash flood. The first was uploaded by the young man on the bench, his angle capturing the entire interaction from across the street. The audio was clear, David's calm, articulate explanations, Officer Riley's aggressive, escalating demands, the moment David identified himself as an attorney, and Riley's mocking dismissal. Then came the second video from the woman inside the restaurant, her view tight on David's face, showing his utter disbelief as the handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. Within an hour, a local news blogger had mashed them together, added a headline, "Civil rights attorney arrested for waiting while black," and posted it to social media. The story exploded. The hashtags started trending almost immediately. Hashtag Justice for David Collier. Hashtag Waiting for a Ride. Hashtag This is why we kneel. It was shared by celebrities, by politicians, by civil rights activists, and by tens of thousands of ordinary people who saw in the video a stark, undeniable example of American injustice. The footage was raw and infuriating. It showed a man being stripped of his dignity for no reason, his professional standing and calm demeanor treated not as assets, but as provocations. By the time David was released from the precinct, a process hastily expedited by a panicked police lieutenant who offered a stuttering, inadequate apology. The story was the lead item on every local news station and was rapidly gaining traction on national cable news. His phone returned to him with his other personal effects was buzzing uncontrollably with calls and texts from his family, his law partners, and reporters from across the country. News vans were already camped out on the street in front of the precinct. The public condemnation was swift and universal. The state chapter of the ACLU released a blistering statement calling the arrest an object lesson in the corrosive effects of racial profiling. The president of the State Bar Association held an impromptu press conference calling Officer Riley's actions a disgrace to the uniform and an attack on the rule of law. The police department's communications office went into crisis mode, releasing a boilerplate statement that they were aware of the incident and that an internal investigation is underway. The statement did nothing to quell the firestorm. The video was the evidence, the trial, and the verdict all in one. The court of public opinion had already convicted Officer Riley and the system that empowered him. The story was no longer about a simple street encounter. It was a national conversation about race power and policing in America, and David Collier against his will had become its face. The lawsuit landed on the city clerk's desk exactly 1 week later. It was not a simple complaint. It was a meticulously crafted 50-page indictment of a broken system written by David and his partners. The document was surgical in its precision. It named Officer Evan Riley for unlawful arrest, false imprisonment, and the violation of David's First and Fourth Amendment rights. It named the police department and the city for systemic failures, citing a pattern of deliberate indifference to Officer Riley's long and documented history of racially biased conduct. The lawsuit detailed all 9 prior complaints against Riley, presenting a damning portrait of a department that repeatedly ignored warning signs and failed to remove a problematic officer from the street. The core of the case, however, was not the legal arguments, but the undeniable evidence. The plaintiff's primary exhibits were the viral videos themselves submitted from multiple angles, their clarity leaving no room for dispute. Every word, every action was captured for a jury to see. For the city's legal department, it was a waking nightmare. They had no defense. They couldn't claim David was a threat. He was a pillar of the legal community. They couldn't claim he was uncooperative. The video showed him calm and articulate until the moment he was wrongfully arrested. They couldn't claim it was a simple misunderstanding. Riley's sneering dismissal of David's credentials was a clear demonstration of malicious intent. A jury trial would be a public crucifixion. David Collier, one of the most skilled litigators in the state, would be the star witness in his own case, recounting the humiliation he endured. The videos would be played on a giant screen in the courtroom over and over again. Officer Riley would be forced to testify and be cross-examined, his flimsy justifications collapsing under the slightest scrutiny. The department's failure to act on his prior complaints would be laid bare. The potential for a massive punitive jury award was astronomical. The public relations damage was already catastrophic. A trial would only compound it. The city's attorneys knew they had only one move: damage control. They approached David's legal team with an offer to enter settlement negotiations almost immediately. They wanted to make this go away to stanch the bleeding. David agreed, but with one non-negotiable condition: the settlement would not be confidential. The details had to be public, a clear admission of wrongdoing. The negotiations were brief. The city, desperate to avoid further public outcry, ultimately agreed to a settlement of $3.7 million. For David, the money was never the point. It was a tool. It was a number large enough to make headlines, large enough to force change, and large enough to serve as a public testament to the price of injustice. The fallout was swift and decisive. As part of the settlement, the city did not have to admit liability, but the facts spoke for themselves. 3 weeks after the settlement was announced, following a perfunctory internal affairs investigation that could only reach one conclusion, Officer Evan Riley was fired. His termination letter cited gross misconduct and a pattern of behavior that brought the department into disrepute. His name was submitted to the National Decertification Index, ensuring that his career in law enforcement was permanently over. He could never again wear a badge and carry a gun in any jurisdiction in the country. But the consequences didn't stop with one officer. The public outcry and the high-profile nature of the case attracted the attention of the U.S. Department of Justice, which launched a full-scale pattern and practice investigation into the city's police department. Their findings, released a year later, confirmed what David's lawsuit had alleged: systemic failures in training, supervision, and discipline, particularly concerning racial bias. The investigation resulted in a legally binding federal consent decree forcing the department to implement sweeping court-monitored reforms. Months later, the noise had faded. The news cycle had moved on. The city had written the check. David Collier sat in his quiet office late one evening, the city lights twinkling outside his window. The framed copy of his Supreme Court argument hung on the wall, a testament to a career spent fighting for others. He looked at it then, at the faint residual marks on his own wrists, visible only to him. The profound, gut-wrenching irony of his ordeal had never left him. He had dedicated his life to defending the Constitution for the marginalized and the powerless, only to have his own rights so casually and completely violated. The $3.7 million was in a trust funding civil rights fellowships for young lawyers. It was doing good work, but it couldn't erase the feeling of being handcuffed on that sidewalk, of being seen as a threat in a world he had worked so hard to improve. The victory felt hollow because the battle should never have been necessary. His case was a win, a big one. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him that on that same day hundreds of other people who weren't famous lawyers, people who didn't have a video camera to save them, had faced their own Evan Rileys and lost. Their stories were never told, their injustices never rectified. His fight had ended in a multi-million-dollar settlement and systemic reform. Theirs ended in a jail cell, a lost job, or worse. The real work, he knew, was not just about winning the landmark cases, but about creating a world where they were no longer needed. What does it truly take to change a system that allows prejudice to wear a badge? And how can we ensure that justice isn't only for those who can command the public's attention? We'd be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If these stories matter to you, please consider supporting our channel so we can continue to demand accountability.
They're speaking Spanish outside. I need proof of citizenship, now.
I was born in this city. I served this country for 20 years. You have no right to detain me.
Failure to comply. Hands behind your back.
My name is Arthur Bennett, U.S. Army veteran, and you're about to make a historic mistake.
Arthur Bennett had served his country for 20 years in the U.S. Army, earning a Bronze Star in the jungles of Vietnam and a Purple Heart for the shrapnel that still ached in his left leg on cold mornings. At 72 years old, he thought his fighting days were long over. He was wrong. His final battle wouldn't be fought in a foreign land, but in the quiet, sterile waiting room of his local community health clinic. It was a battle that would expose a rot deep within federal law enforcement and ultimately cost the U.S. government $6.1 million. The man who started it all, a 35-year-old ICE officer named Kevin Maxwell, was convinced he was a patriot, a protector of the border. By the time he was done, he had destroyed his own career and brought shame upon his agency by handcuffing a decorated American hero for the crime of being a black man who spoke Spanish. Before we get into this, where are you tuning in from? If you believe in justice for our veterans, do me a solid and hit that like button. We need to get this story out there. The Harborview Community Health Center in Charleston, South Carolina is not a fancy place. The paint is a little faded. The chairs in the waiting room have seen better days, and the air always carries the faint, clean scent of antiseptic. But for its patients, mostly working-class folks, retirees on fixed incomes, and a significant number of veterans, it's a sanctuary. It's a place of healing and trust. It was just after 10 a.m. on a bright Tuesday in May. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Arthur Bennett sat patiently waiting for his physical therapy appointment. He'd been coming to Harborview twice a week for 3 years to work on the stiffness in his leg, a stubborn souvenir from the Tet Offensive. He was a pillar of his community, a deacon at his church, a grandfather who taught his grandkids how to fish off the Folly Beach Pier. He wore simple khaki pants, a pressed polo shirt, and worn-in loafers. His posture was still ramrod straight, a habit forged in basic training that a lifetime couldn't break. He was respected. He was quiet. He was in every sense of the word home. But to one man, a man with a badge and a deeply ingrained suspicion, Arthur Bennett looked like a threat. And that man was about to turn a place of healing into a scene of humiliation. ICE Officer Kevin Maxwell wasn't responding to a specific tip or a warrant. He was conducting what his supervisor called proactive enforcement in a high-traffic area. In reality, he was driving his unmarked vehicle through neighborhoods he deemed suspicious, looking for targets. At 35, Maxwell was a zealot. He had been with ICE for 6 years, and in that time he had amassed a reputation for aggressive, borderline reckless stops. He saw potential immigration violations everywhere. He viewed the world in stark black and white citizens and aliens, legal and illegal, us and them. The nuance of a community, the tapestry of lives lived together, was lost on him. He saw a threat matrix. He had pulled into the Harborview Clinic's parking lot because he'd seen a landscaping crew of Hispanic men working near the entrance. He decided to sit and watch. He saw nothing. Then he saw Arthur Bennett walk out of the physical therapy wing to stretch his legs. At the same moment, the clinic's janitor, a man named Marco, came outside for a smoke break. Marco, a legal resident from El Salvador, had worked at the clinic for a decade and knew Arthur well. "Buenos dias, Señor Bennett. ¿Cómo está la pierna?" Marco asked with a friendly smile. Arthur, who had picked up conversational Spanish from his Puerto Rican comrades in the army, smiled back. "Un poco tiesa hoy, mi amigo. Getting old is hell." They shared a brief laugh. It was a simple human moment. Two men acquaintances sharing a pleasantry in the morning sun. But through the tinted windshield of Officer Maxwell's vehicle, this interaction was transformed. He saw a black man who in his mind shouldn't know Spanish conversing with a Hispanic man. His brain, wired for suspicion and fueled by prejudice, leaped to a conclusion. This was a coordinated exchange, something illicit. Smuggling, trafficking, false documents, it could be anything. He had his probable cause. He put his vehicle in park, clipped his radio to his tactical vest, and walked toward the clinic, his mind already convinced he had found a criminal hiding in plain sight. Do you think law enforcement officers should be allowed to conduct proactive patrols in sensitive locations like clinics without a warrant? Let us know your thoughts below. Officer Maxwell didn't bother checking in at the front desk. He strode past the receptionist, his eyes scanning the waiting area until they locked onto Arthur Bennett, who had just returned to his seat. Maxwell walked directly up to him, his shadow falling over the older man. His presence was immediately jarring in the quiet clinic. "I need to see your identification, proof of citizenship." Arthur looked up, startled. He saw a young, intense man in a tactical vest with ICE emblazoned across the chest. He was confused, but not intimidated. Decades of facing down real danger had left him with a reserve of calm. "Excuse me, son. Is there a problem? I saw you outside. I need to see your papers. Now." Maxwell's tone was sharp, demanding. Arthur's confusion hardened into a slow-burning anger. Papers. The word felt alien, insulting. "I'm a citizen of this country. I was born in this city. I'm here for a doctor's appointment." He reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate. He pulled out his South Carolina driver's license and his VA health card. He held them out. "This is who I am. Arthur Bennett, United States Army retired." Maxwell barely glanced at them. "These don't prove citizenship. I need a passport or a birth certificate." "A birth certificate?" Arthur said with a disbelieving laugh. "I don't carry my birth certificate around with me. Who does? I'm 72 years old." At this point, the clinic's head nurse, Carol Peterson, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, noticed the confrontation. She walked over, her expression a mixture of concern and irritation. "Is there an issue, officer? This is Mr. Bennett. He's been a patient here for years." Maxwell turned on her, his voice dripping with authority. "Ma'am, this is a federal investigation. You need to step away or you'll be interfering." He turned back to Arthur. "You're refusing to provide proof of status. I'm starting to think you're not who you say you are." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Arthur, a man who had bled for his country, was being called a liar by a man half his age in a place he came to for care. Son Arthur said, his voice low and steady, "You are making a very big mistake." "That's it. You're coming with me," Maxwell declared, his patience gone. He reached for a pair of plastic zip-tie cuffs on his belt. The quiet hum of the waiting room evaporated. Conversations stopped. Every head turned. An elderly woman gasped. Arthur looked at the plastic cuffs and then back at Maxwell's face, a mask of grim determination. "You're going to arrest me for what? For sitting in a clinic waiting room, failure to comply, suspicion of immigration violations." Maxwell's voice was loud now, performing for the small captive audience. He grabbed Arthur's arm. Arthur didn't resist physically, but he didn't make it easy either. He stood slowly, his bad leg aching in protest. "Get your hands off me. I am not a criminal." Several people in the waiting room had already pulled out their cell phones. The red dots of recording lights blinked on, one by one. A young man sitting with his mother angled his phone, making sure to get both Arthur and Maxwell in the frame. The audio was crystal clear. "This is insane," a woman whispered off camera. "He's arresting that old man," Nurse Carol, standing nearby, spoke up again, her voice shaking with rage. "His VA card is right there. He's a veteran. What is wrong with you?" Maxwell ignored her. He forced Arthur's arms behind his back. The zip tie pulled tight against the 72-year-old's wrinkled skin. Arthur winced in pain as the plastic bit into his wrists, aggravating his arthritis. But his voice, when he spoke, did not waver. He turned his head slightly, speaking directly to the phones now recording his humiliation. "My name is Arthur Bennett. I am a veteran of the United States Army. I served in Vietnam. This officer is arresting me in my doctor's office for no reason. I want everyone to record this. Let everyone see this." He had spent a lifetime following orders, but he also knew an unlawful one when he heard it. He would comply, but he would not be silent. He would not be erased. He would make sure there was a record. Should a VA card be considered sufficient proof of citizenship to stop a detention like this? Drop your opinion in the comments. The 20-minute ride to the local ICE field office was silent. Arthur Bennett sat in the back of the vehicle, the zip-tie cuffs digging into his wrists, and committed every detail to memory, the time on the dashboard clock, the smug look on Maxwell's face in the rearview mirror, the crackle of the radio. He had been trained in reconnaissance in observing the enemy. The situation was different, but the skills were the same. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an operation, and he was gathering intelligence for the battle to come. When they arrived at the processing center, Maxwell marched him inside with a sense of triumph. He presented Arthur to his direct supervisor, David Chen, a veteran ICE agent in his late 50s who had seen it all. Chen was a by-the-book bureaucrat, a man who believed in procedures and paperwork, not gut feelings. "What do you have, Maxwell?" Chen asked, not looking up from a file on his desk. "Got a possible illegal, sir. Black male caught him consorting with a known foreign national. He's speaking fluent Spanish but can't produce a birth certificate. Refused to identify his status. I think he's using a fake VA card as a cover." Chen finally looked up. He saw a calm, dignified, elderly black man standing in plastic cuffs. He saw Maxwell puffed up with self-importance. An alarm bell honed by 30 years of federal service went off in his head. This felt wrong. Consorting with a known foreign national who the janitor at the Harborview Clinic. Is the janitor here illegally? Maxwell hesitated. "Well, no, I haven't run his papers yet, but the subject's behavior was highly suspicious." Chen sighed a deep, weary sound. He looked past Maxwell and addressed Arthur directly, his tone respectful. "Sir, what is your name and date of birth?" Arthur gave it to him, his voice even. "Arthur Bennett, August 12th, 1953. Chen turned to his computer terminal and typed in the information. He hit enter. The system cross-referenced federal databases. FBI DHSDODVA. It took less than 5 seconds. David Chen stared at the computer screen. The color drained from his face. The profile that flashed up wasn't that of an undocumented immigrant. It was a decorated American hero, Bennett Arthur M. SGTUS, SG, Army retired, service 1971 to 1991. Awards: Bronze Star Medal, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal. Chen's eyes scanned the file. Vietnam, the Tet Offensive. Honorable discharge. No criminal record. Not so much as a speeding ticket in the last 30 years. He looked from the screen to the elderly man in handcuffs, then to the smug officer who had arrested him. The supervisor's blood ran cold. Maxwell Chen said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What have you done?" At that exact moment, the office's public affairs officer burst out of her office, her phone in her hand, her face pale with panic. "Dave, we have a major problem. A video is going viral. It's us. It shows one of our officers arresting an elderly black man at the Harborview Clinic. The news outlets are already calling. They're saying we arrested a Vietnam vet. The dam had broken." The videos from the clinic uploaded by multiple witnesses were exploding across social media. The headlines were brutal and swift. "Ice cuffs. 72-year-old decorated war hero in clinic waiting room. I served in Vietnam. Final words of black veteran before ICE detention." The outrage was a tidal wave. Veterans of foreign wars and the American Legion issued furious condemnations. The ACLU and the NAACP announced they were investigating. The director of the Harborview Clinic gave a tearful press conference calling Maxwell's actions a monstrous violation of a sacred space. Marco the janitor was surrounded by reporters telling them through an interpreter, "Mr. Bennett is a good man. He is kind. He always asks about my family. This is a crime." The story was no longer about a questionable arrest. It was about a nation dishonoring one of its heroes. Within hours, one of the top civil rights law firms in the country had contacted Arthur Bennett, offering to take his case pro bono. The lawsuit they filed against the Department of Homeland Security IC and Officer Kevin Maxwell personally was a masterclass in legal outrage. It alleged a litany of violations: unlawful detention, false imprisonment violation of 4th and 14th Amendment rights, racial profiling, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. It wasn't just about the arrest, it was about the system that allowed it to happen. The discovery process was devastating for the government. Arthur's lawyers subpoenaed Maxwell's records, and a disturbing pattern emerged. In his 6 years with the agency, Maxwell had initiated over 400 stops. Nearly 90% of those targeted were people of color. He had a dozen civilian complaints filed against him for overly aggressive tactics and baseless detentions. In every single case, his supervisor, the same one who encouraged proactive enforcement, had cleared him, typically with a note praising his high arrest numbers and proactive mindset. The lawyers deposed Nurse Carol, who testified that Maxwell had threatened her for simply trying to identify a patient. They deposed the other patients from the waiting room, whose cell phone videos provided an unshakable minute-by-minute account of the incident. They deposed Supervisor David Chen, who testified under oath that Maxwell's justification for the arrest speaking Spanish to a janitor was not, and had never been, a valid reason for a detention. The case was airtight. The government's own records painted a picture of a rogue officer enabled by a negligent system who was allowed to operate with impunity until he finally targeted the wrong person, a man with an unimpeachable record of service and a community willing to bear witness. Why do you think supervisors in law enforcement sometimes ignore repeated complaints against certain officers? Share your perspective. Faced with irrefutable video evidence, a mountain of damning internal records, and the public relations nightmare of putting a decorated Purple Heart recipient on the witness stand, the federal government did the only thing it could do. It surrendered. 10 months after the incident, they settled with Arthur Bennett for $6.1 million. The settlement was one of the largest of its kind for a wrongful detention case. The consequences for those involved were severe. Officer Kevin Maxwell was fired. His name was added to the National Decertification Index, ensuring he could never work in law enforcement in the United States again. His career built on suspicion and aggression was over at 36. His supervisor was demoted and transferred to a desk job in rural North Dakota. The scandal triggered a full-scale Department of Justice investigation into the Charleston Ice Field office, which ultimately led to a nationwide policy change severely restricting warrantless enforcement actions in sensitive locations like hospitals, clinics, and places of worship. Arthur Bennett, a man who never sought the spotlight, found himself standing at a press conference, the cameras flashing, the microphones pushed toward his face. He didn't speak of anger or revenge. He spoke with a quiet, profound sorrow. "I served this country in a war," he said, his voice steady. "I believed I was fighting for a nation that valued freedom and justice. But the freedom I fought for abroad was denied to me right here at home in the place I go for medical care. This was never about the money. It was about making sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else, whether they wore a uniform or not." His words hung in the air, a final, powerful testimony from a soldier who had been forced to fight one last battle for the soul of the country he loved. The cameras eventually left, the lawyers went home, and the world moved on to the next headline. But for Arthur, the silence that followed was heavy. The money couldn't erase the memory of the plastic cuffs tightening on his wrists or the sting of being treated like a foreigner in his own home. He still went to the Harborview Clinic twice a week, and the nurses and patients still greeted him with warmth. But something had changed. A place of healing had been tainted by a memory of violation. He had won the settlement, he had forced a change in policy, but he had lost a piece of the simple peace he had worked his entire life to secure. The shrapnel in his leg was a reminder of a war he understood. This new wound, this ache in his spirit, was a reminder of a conflict far more complicated, a battle against the shadows of prejudice that could accost a man anywhere at any time, even a hero in his own hometown. Does a monetary settlement ever truly equal justice in cases like this? What can we as a community do to better protect our elders and veterans from these kinds of profiling incidents? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you believe these stories need to be told, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us hold power accountable.